She woke up wrong. Not in the slow, forgiving way of someone easing out of deep rest, but in the sudden, lurching way of a body that had registered danger before the mind caught up. One moment there was warmth and the distant sound of rain. The next, her eyes were open and nothing around her made sense. The seat beneath her was leather, dark, the kind of interior that belonged to someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Outside the rain-streaked windows, the city moved past in amber and shadow, streets she didn't recognize, buildings she couldn't place. The car was still moving. She was still buckled in. She didn't remember doing that. And there was a man beside her. She took him the way panic always breaks things into pieces, a jaw cut clean as architecture, hands resting open on his thighs, deliberately still, she noticed, the way people are still when they want you to know they're not a threat and are leaving the conclusion to you. A black suit without a single crease, and eyes that were already on her, steady and unreadable, watching her the way you watch something you've been thinking about for a while. Her bag. She still had her bag. Both hands found the strap before she'd made the decision to reach for it, and she pulled it against her chest, and she saw something shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, like a man who had expected exactly that and found it, against all his instincts, almost worth something. Don't scream. The thought arrived in her nurse voice, calm, clinical, the one she used at 3 a.m. when everything was going wrong and someone needed her to be the steadiest person in the room. Screaming tells him you've stopped thinking. You need to think. She looked at the door. She looked at him. She measured the distance between those two things and made a decision. Where are we going? Her voice came out level. She was quietly proud of that. He considered the question with the patience of someone who was never rushed by anything. Nowhere dangerous, he said. His voice was low and even, the kind that didn't need volume to carry weight. Not tonight. Not tonight. She filed that away. I got into the wrong car. You did. And you let me sleep. Something moved behind his eyes. You were tired. The car slowed. Through the window, she finally recognized her street, her building, the flickering light above the entrance she'd been meaning to report to the super for 3 weeks. She reached for the door handle and he made no move to stop her, just watched, hands still open, giving her the exit without being asked. Go inside, Naya. She went. She took the stairs, 4 flights, legs that barely belonged to her, one hand trailing the wall. She unlocked her apartment, dropped her bag, and sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees pulled to her chest, and stayed there until the shaking stopped. She didn't call the police. She told herself it was because she was too tired to explain it. She told herself that in the morning, when everything felt less like a fever dream, she would figure out what to do. She was still telling herself that 7 days later when she reached into her bag for her keys and her fingers found something else. A card, cream-colored and plain, with nothing on it but a phone number pressed into the paper in a clean, unhurried type. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put the card in front of her. She poured a glass of water she didn't drink. He hadn't come back for her. He hadn't needed to. He had simply left a door open and trusted her to decide whether she was the kind of person who walked through it. That, somehow, was worse. She sat with it for a long time. The card, the quiet, the question she didn't have an answer to yet. Outside, the city moved on without her. Inside, something she wasn't ready to name had already begun. She made the call on a Wednesday evening, standing in her kitchen with the card flat on the counter in front of her and 7 days of justifications stacked neatly behind her. She had rehearsed it. The speech was good, clear, firm, the kind of language she used when a family member needed a boundary explained without room for negotiation. Do not contact me. Do not send anyone to contact me. What happened was an accident and it ends there. She had it memorized. She dialed before she could talk herself out of it. He answered on the second ring. Silence. Not the silence of someone caught off guard, the silence of someone who had been waiting and was in no hurry to fill the space. She could hear him breathing, steady and unhurried, and it was somehow worse than if he had spoken first, because it meant he was going to let her go first, and she had prepared for resistance, not patience. She got through the first sentence. Then she stopped. "I was wondering," he said, "which of us would move first." She closed her eyes. "I want to know why you had someone put that card in my bag." A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. The difference was something she was beginning to recognize. "Because I wasn't ready for it to be over." She sat with that for longer than she intended to, longer than was sensible. The speech dissolved somewhere in the silence, and she didn't go looking for it. They met the following evening at a Korean restaurant 20 minutes from the hospital. Small, warmly lit, the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and intended to stay. Public, ordinary, nothing like the car. She arrived first and took a table near the window. She almost left at 12 minutes past when she decided this was a mistake. She almost left again at 16 minutes past when she decided it was a worse mistake than she'd originally estimated. At exactly the agreed time, he walked in. She had seen him in darkness and in shadow, and in the amber blur of streetlights through rain-soaked glass. She had not seen him like this, in full light, unhurried, moving through an ordinary room as though he had simply decided it was his. He sat across from her, and she understood with uncomfortable clarity that the dark had been doing her a favor. They ordered food neither of them ate much of. He laid out his proposition in the same way he did everything, precisely, without excess. A private clinic for his organization's people, legitimate care for workers and families who couldn't navigate the system. Nothing illegal, nothing that would cost her the career she'd spent a decade building. She listened without interrupting. Then she gave him her terms, one by one, watching his face for the flinch that didn't come. Any life-threatening injury went to a hospital. No exceptions, no negotiations. If he lied to her, once, she was gone. He accepted everything. No pause, no counteroffer, no attempt to soften the edges of her conditions. Just agreed. That told her more than the proposition had. She walked out into the night air with the card still in her pocket and the weight of a decision she'd already made without quite admitting it. The justifications were already forming. She was helping people who needed care. The money was real. It was strictly professional. She would have them polished by morning. She was already fairly sure they wouldn't hold. She had expected something that looked like a secret. A basement entrance, maybe, or rooms that felt borrowed and provisional, the kind of space that knew it wasn't supposed to exist. What she found instead, when Hyun-Woo opened the door and stepped aside to let her through first, was a clinic that looked like someone had taken the idea of care seriously and built toward it deliberately. Clean floors, examination rooms with proper equipment, nothing improvised. A supply room stocked with materials she recognized and respected, organized in a way that suggested whoever had done it understood the difference between having supplies and having the right ones. She moved through it slowly, and he let her. That was the thing she noticed most. He gave her the walkthrough in less than 5 minutes, efficiently and without flourish, and then he simply stopped. Stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets and watched her form her own conclusions without inserting himself into them. No sale, no reassurance, just space. She didn't know what to do with that yet, so she filed it away and kept moving. The last examination room was occupied. A woman sat on the table with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting in medical offices for decades and had made her peace with it. Upright, hands folded, a dark coat buttoned to the collar despite the warmth of the room. 60-something, Naya guessed, then revised upward. Sharp eyes that moved to Naya immediately and didn't move away. "You're new," the woman said, not unkindly, simply as a fact that had been assessed and confirmed. "I am." Naya stepped in, reached for the chart on the table's edge. Blood pressure management, regular visits, no complications. "Mrs. Seo, I'm Naya. I'll be taking over your care here." Mrs. Seo looked at her the way certain patients did, not evaluating her credentials, but evaluating something underneath them, something that couldn't be read off a chart. The assessment lasted approximately 30 seconds. Naya had the distinct impression she was not the one conducting it. "Are you going to stay?" Mrs. Seo asked. The question landed with more weight than it should have for a first appointment. Naya held the chart and considered giving a professional answer, the kind she kept ready for questions she didn't want to answer directly. "I don't know yet," she said instead. Something in Mrs. Seo's expression shifted, not quite approval, but the thing that comes just before it. "That's honest." She rolled up her sleeve without being asked. "I'll be back Thursday." She was, and the Thursday after that. Naya drove home that evening not about Hyun-Woo, which surprised her, not about the clinic's equipment or the terms she'd set or the several ways this could still go wrong. She thought about Mrs. Seo's question, the plainness of it, the way it had bypassed every professional layer she'd walked in wearing and asked something real instead. "Are you going to stay?" She didn't have an answer. The road moved under her and the city lights blurred past the windows, and she turned the question over slowly, the way you turn over something that might be important before you understand why. What alarmed her, mildly but unmistakably, was that she wanted one. 2 months passed the way good work always passed, faster than expected, fuller than anticipated, leaving her at the end of each day with the specific tiredness that came from being genuinely used rather than simply depleted. The patients came in the way Hyun-Woo had described and she had half believed. A construction worker with a shoulder injury he'd been quietly managing for 3 months because he couldn't afford the time off that a hospital visit would cost him. A grandmother with diabetes whose English wasn't strong enough to navigate the forms at the clinic across town. 2 brothers, teenagers, who came in together for vaccinations they'd aged out of the school system before receiving, sitting rigidly side by side and pretending not to be relieved when it was over quickly. Ordinary people with ordinary needs, and the specific exhaustion of having learned not to ask for help through the channels that were supposed to provide it. She was good at this. She had always been good at the medicine, but this was something adjacent to medicine, the patience required to make someone feel seen before you made them feel treated. And she was better at it than she'd had room to be in the ER, where the volume never allowed for it. Here it did. The patients noticed. They came back. They brought their families. She noticed other things too, slower than she should have. It started with an article left on her desk, a piece about a new wound care protocol she'd mentioned once in passing, so briefly she barely remembered saying it. She assumed Hyun-Woo had asked someone to print it. She read it, set it aside, didn't think about it further. Then there was another, a profile of a physician whose approach to community care mirrored something she'd said during their first clinic walkthrough, a half-formed thought she hadn't expected anyone to retain. Then a short essay, this one in Korean, with a single line translated in the margin in handwriting she recognized by then. Precise, unhurried, the pen pressed with the same steadiness he brought to everything. She read them all. She said nothing, neither did he. Mrs. Seo noticed on a Thursday in the 2nd month, settling into the examination chair with the ease of someone who had been observing things for long enough that very little required explanation anymore. "He leaves you things to read," she said, rolling up her sleeve without being asked. Naya reached for the blood pressure cuff. "It's professional, relevant to the work. My husband used to do that." Mrs. Seo's voice carried the particular evenness of someone delivering a verdict they'd reached some time ago. "Leave me things. Articles mostly. A poem once." A pause. "It means he's paying attention in the way that counts." "It's not like that." Mrs. Seo looked at her. "You're a good nurse. You're a terrible liar." Naya said nothing. She recorded the reading, which was perfect as always, and moved on with the appointment, and did not give Mrs. Seo the satisfaction of a response. She found a new article on her desk that evening, something about emergency triage methodology, precisely relevant to a case she'd handled that morning, and mentioned to no one. Hyun-Woo had not been scheduled at the clinic that day. She had checked. She stood at her desk and looked at it for a moment. She wasn't surprised. She was something else, something she didn't immediately reach for a name for. Warmer than she'd been when she arrived that morning, and less inclined than usual to argue with it. The list had existed in one form or another since the night she'd sat at her kitchen table with a business card and a glass of water she didn't drink. It was a good list, thorough, reasonable, updated regularly, the kind of mental document she maintained with the same discipline she brought to patient charts and medication logs. He was dangerous. His world was dangerous. She had a nursing license she had worked a decade to earn. She had a mother who called every Sunday and would not survive the truth of this. She didn't know the full shape of what he had done, only the edges of it, and the edges were enough to understand that the full shape was not something she could look at directly and remain comfortable. She added to it whenever something threatened to loosen it, a conversation that ran too long, an article left on her desk that she'd read twice, the particular quality of his attention when she spoke, the way it didn't wander, not even slightly, as though everything she said was information he intended to keep. The list held. She was good at lists. And then one evening in the 3rd month, sitting across from him in his office after the clinic had emptied, the conversation drifted the way it sometimes did, away from logistics, away from the work, into the quieter territory they had both been carefully not acknowledging. She had grown accustomed to these drifts. She'd stopped pretending they were accidental. He was looking at the window when he said it, not to her exactly, more the way you say something out loud that has been sitting too long in silence. His mother had brought him to this city when he was 11, he said. She had believed, for a while, that distance from his father's world would be enough, that geography could do what she hadn't been able to. She was wrong, but she didn't stop believing it until very near the end, and he had never decided whether that made her foolish or extraordinary. He didn't frame it as a confession. He didn't look at her while he said it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and she nodded, and the conversation moved on to something else as though the door had only been opened briefly, not torn from its hinges. She thought about it on the drive home, and then she sat with it in her apartment in the specific quiet of late evening and understood what had actually happened, not what he'd said, but why he'd said it. He hadn't told her to earn something or explain something or ask for anything at all. He had told her because she was there, and somewhere along the way he had decided she was someone who could hold it without it changing how she looked at him. She opened the list. She sat with it for a long time, turning through the entries, reading each one, waiting for the familiar weight of them to settle back into place. It didn't come. She tried to add something new and found she couldn't locate the thread she'd been pulling on for months. The arguments were all still technically true, they simply no longer felt like arguments. She closed the list. She didn't open it again. She heard them before she saw them. The door hitting the wall with the particular force of someone who hadn't had a hand free to open it properly. And then Jin-so's voice, stripped of everything except necessity. He's been shot. She was already moving. The part of her that had spent 6 years in emergency rooms took over, with the clean, immediate authority it always did in the moments that required it, setting aside everything that was personal, everything that was frightened, everything that had been sitting quietly in her chest for 3 months and was now suddenly, urgently irrelevant. She directed Jin-so to the nearest examination table, called Dr. Webb's number from memory while snapping on gloves, gave him the situation in the flat, efficient language of someone who needed a specific response and didn't have time to ask for it twice. He said he'd be there in 30 minutes. She told him to make it 20. 2 wounds, left shoulder, mid-torso on the right side. She cut away his jacket, the precise, unhesitating cut she'd done hundreds of times, and assessed, and the clinical part of her was already running probabilities and prioritizing interventions and identifying what she had in this room and what she'd need Webb for. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. It was the thing she relied on most and had never once had reason to doubt. She worked. She applied pressure, monitored, prepared. She spoke to Jin-so in the hallway in short, clear sentences. What had happened, when, how much blood he'd lost in transit. Jin-so answered with the same economy, An ambush outside a restaurant. 2 men. They hadn't seen them until it was already done. He said it without expression, which told her the lack of expression was costing him something. Webb arrived in 22 minutes. She scrubbed in without being asked, handed instruments with the timing of someone who had done this in worse conditions, and kept her eyes on the work, because the work was what was needed, and she was good at the work, and that was enough. That had to be enough. It took 2 hours. When it was over, Webb stripped off his gloves, told her the shoulder would need follow-up, and the right side had been closer than it looked, but was clean now, and left the way he'd come. Quietly, without ceremony, asking nothing. Jin-So was in the hallway. She told him the result in 4 words. He nodded once and didn't move, which she understood to mean he intended to stay. She went back in. Hyun-Woo was breathing, steadily, evenly, the deep, unconscious rhythm of someone the immediate danger had passed for. The monitors were calm. The room was quiet. There was nothing left that required her to be steady. She stood at the side of the table and looked at him for a long moment, the stillness of his face, the careful rise and fall of his chest, and then she looked down at her hands. They were shaking. Not violently, just a fine, persistent tremor she hadn't allowed while it mattered, and couldn't stop now that it didn't. She pressed them flat against her thighs, and breathed and let it move through her. This thing she'd been holding back with discipline alone, and understood with quiet, unwelcome clarity exactly what it meant. She pulled a chair to the side of the table. She sat down. She stayed. Mrs. Sale arrived at 9 in the morning and took one look at Nia and said nothing for a moment. The particular nothing of someone who has seen enough of life to recognize its residue on a person's face. "You look like someone who spent the night deciding something," she said, settling into the examination chair with the unhurried ease of a woman who had been sitting in this specific chair on this specific day for long enough that it had become hers in some informal but absolute way. Nia reached for the blood pressure cuff. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine." She wasn't fine. She had not slept. She had sat beside the examination table until sometime past 4 in the morning, monitoring vitals that had stabilized hours earlier, and she had not been able to locate a convincing reason to leave. She had come back to her desk at dawn and opened charts she couldn't focus on, and was still sitting there when Mrs. Seo knocked. The appointment proceeded the way their appointments always did, and then, somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of it, blood pressure recorded, notes updated, the comfortable quiet that had built between them over months of Thursdays, Mrs. Seo asked a question so simply that Nia answered it before she understood she'd been asked. "How long have you known it was more than work?" A pause. "A while." "And what are you afraid of?" She heard herself answer that too. Getting it wrong, getting it right, what it would mean to care about someone whose world she could only ever partially see, what it would cost her if she let herself in fully and found out the cost was more than she'd estimated. She said things she had not said in her journal, had not said to the friend she called when everything else felt manageable, had not fully said to herself in the privacy of her own thinking. Mrs. Seo listened to all of it with the stillness of someone who was not collecting information, but simply making room. When Nia finished, the clinic was quiet. Mrs. Seo began rolling down her sleeve with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "My son works for Mr. Choi, has for 11 years. Nia went still. "I know what kind of man he is." She smoothed her cuff, not looking up. Not the stories, not the reputation, the man. Now she looked up, and her eyes were clear and direct and held something that had been there all along, Nia realized, every Thursday, every question, every silence. "You already know too, or you wouldn't have stayed last night." She picked up her bag. She stood with the ease of someone who had said exactly what she came to say and had no need to oversell it. The question was never whether he was safe. She paused at the door. "The question is whether you're brave enough to the truth of him." She left for her next appointment. Nia sat in the empty clinic and looked at the space Mrs. Seo had just occupied and felt something reorganize itself quietly in her chest, Not a revelation, not a decision, but a recognition. The kind that arrives not as news, but as confirmation of something the body already knew. She had not been watching this world from the outside for months. She had been inside it, learning its rhythms, earning its trust, staying when she could have left, and she had made her peace with that so gradually she had never noticed the moment it happened. She sat with that for a long time. Then she checked the monitors, updated the chart, and went to sit beside him again. She was reviewing his chart when he said her name, not loudly, just her name, in the low, careful voice of someone testing whether sound still worked the way they remembered. And she turned from the medication table and found him awake. Not the shallow, confused waking of someone still fighting their way to the surface, but fully present, his eyes on her with the same steadiness they always held, dimmed slightly by pain and the residue of 2 days of unconsciousness, but unmistakably his. She crossed to the monitors first, checked the readings with the same deliberate sequence she had been running every few hours since Webb left, methodical, thorough, her eyes on the numbers rather than his face. Everything was where it should be. She noted it. She set down the chart. "You stayed," he said. "You were my patient." He looked at her for a long moment, the dark circles, the clothes she had not gone home to change, the precise professional distance she was maintaining with her posture. She watched him read all of it and knew he was reading it accurately and did not look away. "Naya," he said, "just her name, nothing attached to it." She sat down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms were quiet very early in the morning, not empty but settled, the world outside not yet making its demands. She had been awake for the better part of 2 days. She was tired in a way that had moved past discomfort into something almost clarifying, the way extreme cold eventually stops feeling like cold and becomes simply the truth of the air. He spoke first, and he spoke without the careful architecture she had come to recognize as his default, the measured pacing, the precise word selection, the sense of a man who considered each thing before releasing it. That was gone. What replaced it was simpler and more unguarded than anything she had heard from him in 4 months of Thursdays and shared silences, and articles left on her desk without explanation. He told her what she had come to mean to him, not as a speech, as a series of small, true things, delivered quietly, one after another, the way you speak when you have run out of reasons to edit yourself. She listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she told him the things she had not said to Mrs. Seo, had not written anywhere, had barely allowed herself to think in language, that she was not afraid of him, not afraid of his world, not afraid of any of the things she had listed so carefully in the early months. She was afraid of the version of the previous 2 days in which the outcome had been different. She was afraid of how much that version had cost her to imagine, and what that cost meant, and what she was going to do with the meaning. He didn't try to resolve it. He didn't offer reassurance or reframe it into something easier. He just received it, the way she had received what he'd told her, as something real that deserved to be held rather than answered. His mother had tried to save him, she thought, had believed that love could redirect a life already in motion. That was not what she was doing. She wasn't trying to save him or change him or pull him toward a version of himself she decided was better. She was simply looking at who he actually was and staying in the room. She thought he understood the difference. The way he was looking at her suggested he had never been offered it before. His hand moved across the narrow space between them and found hers, and she turned her palm to meet it without deciding to, the way you respond to something that doesn't require a decision. Neither of them said anything else. Outside, the city was beginning to make its first sounds. Inside, in the quiet of the clinic room, something had been decided. Not in the moment his hand found hers, she thought, but long before that, and this was simply the first time either of them had stopped pretending otherwise.
She noticed the tail 3 blocks from the hospital. It came back to her the way things learned in unexpected places sometimes did. A patient, years ago, a domestic violence intake that had gone long because the woman needed to talk before she could answer questions. She had described exactly this: the same car at 2 turns, hanging back far enough to look coincidental, close enough to not lose her. "They make it look like traffic," the woman had said. "That's how you know it's not." Nia turned left where she had intended to turn right. The car turned left. She didn't panic. She drove 2 more blocks, made her expression neutral in the rearview mirror by force of habit, and called Jinso. He answered immediately, which told her he had been expecting something like this for longer than she had. She gave him the cross streets. He told her where to go. 20 minutes later, she was in the lobby of Hyun-Woo's building, and by the time the elevator reached his floor, she had decided exactly how this conversation was going to begin. She walked in and put her bag down and said, "I was followed tonight. I need to know how bad this is." He looked at her for a moment, something moving behind his eyes that she recognized as recalibration, the adjustment of a man who had prepared for one version of this conversation and was now in a different one. She had come to him. She had come to him first, before he could manage the information into something she could handle, and he understood that, and she needed him to. He told her everything. The Bake organization. 3 months of surveillance, beginning around the time his patterns changed, a new location, irregular hours, a variable that hadn't existed in his schedule before, what they had collected, what they intended to do with it. He told her without softening the edges, because she had asked for the truth and he had learned, at some cost, that she meant it when she asked. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she watched him move to the window, and she watched the shift that came over him, something tightening in his posture, his thinking visibly accelerating toward options that were faster and more irreversible than careful. She had seen it before, not in him, in patients standing at the edge of decisions they couldn't come back from, the ones who had been frightened long enough that fear had converted itself into the will to end the thing causing it, whatever the cost. "Stop," she said. He stopped. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and placed 2 fingers against his sternum, not a gesture, a location, precise and deliberate, the way she would indicate a specific site to a colleague. "Here, this is what I'm talking about. I know what you're about to do. I know why, and I know what it would cost you, not in consequences. Here." She held his gaze. "You have spent your entire life trying not to become your father. Don't become him for me." The room was quiet for a long time. Then something in him settled, not collapsed, not surrendered, but settled, the way a decision feels when it's been made by the right part of a person. It took 3 weeks. She watched him work with the particular focus of someone who had chosen the harder path and intended to finish it. Financial, reputational, structural, the Bake organization's foundation taken apart with precision rather than force. Each move deliberate, none of them the kind his father would have recognized as strength. It was harder than the alternative. He didn't pretend otherwise. He came to the clinic on the days he could and left articles on her desk and said very little, and she understood that the silence was the work, and she let him have it. When it was done, he told her simply, standing on the roof of his building in the early evening with the air carrying the first suggestion of a coming season, "I didn't walk away, but I didn't become him either." She looked at him, this man who had spent his entire adult life building armor against the version of himself he was most afraid of, who had just chosen the slow, hard thing over the fast, brutal one, for no reason that had anything to do with strategy. "That's the version of you I've been watching for," she said. He took her hand. Below them, the city moved on, indifferent and continuous the way cities did. She thought about Mrs. So's question, the plainness of it, the first Thursday it had landed, "Are you going to stay?" and how long she had been carrying it without an answer. She had one now. Yes, both of them. Staying.